Cool. Yeah, hey everybody, and it's cool to see Lee. I see Lee every once in a while. It's one of our board members, but we'll get into that. And so I've been in and out of this conference today. I was on a plane this morning, and I had to take care of some stuff, but so I didn't get to hear everything. But I kind of had it on the background while I was doing some work, and it's really good. Like just you a lot of time in tech, even if you're working with people, you end up working in isolation, just the nature of it a lot. And to get just hearing people talking about slightly different ideas in different areas, it helps so much, like re-energize and get you thinking again about like why you're doing things, particularly if you do get disconnected at times. So I found that really helpful, not to mention the actual ideas, of course, and different initiatives that people are doing. So that's been really awesome. It was really cool to see Lee's talk. He's on the board for Native Land Digital, which is the organization that's now running Native Land. And it's really great to get a chance to see his work. He was one of the first people that like reached out to me when he found out about Native Land, and it's been huge help. Like I said, I'll get into that a bit more. So I don't have like presentation share screen, so I'm just going to be chatting so you get to see my face. I thought I would just kind of make this a bit more informal and just talk a little bit about some of the technical elements of native land, as well as the going. Um, so yeah, so native land. I'm going to kind of assume that most people seeing this have perhaps run into the site. If not, just go to native-land.ca. It's basically a site that maps out Indigenous territories, treaties, and languages across the world, but mostly North America, some of South America, and Oceania, so Australia and New Zealand, or Aotearoa. I'm not going to go over too much, just the basic functionality of the site. It's pretty straightforward. Search a location, see more information about the land that you live on. I want to kind of focus a bit more on the process of having created the site in a technical sense, also on running the site and my experiences with the organization, and helping put together this organization, and how it's been starting to take over and improve the goals and directions of the site, which has been a really exciting thing to see. Um, so it'll be a little more technical than I often am when I give talks. A lot of times I'm just kind of talking to a very general audience about the site and our goals and our problems. But I thought like sharing a bit more about the tech would be useful. Maybe even just useful for me to see what I've been doing all these years. um, and also the logistical process, which is pretty separate than the tech process and has been a real learning opportunity for me to see how to the work that it takes to put together an organization and how that differs so completely than building an application, really. So first, to just like give a little introduction to native land. So as I said, it's a site that maps Indigenous territories, treaties, and languages across the world. Originally, the site came into existence. I didn't have such a big vision or anything like that. It was kind of a spin-off of another project that I'd been working on that was about mapping resource development in Canada after I was part of some pipeline protests. Um, and I was just mapping out like where are resource development projects happening? Are there resistance movements? Not necessarily like anti-development. It was just kind of like trying to get it all on a map so we could actually have a sense of where things were happening. But in the process of doing that, I also wanted to map out whose traditional territories these projects were happening on. And as I started to kind of do that and learn a bit and start doing some research, I realized like it would be pretty cool to just be able to search a location and then get that information about like what about where I grew up, or what about where I went to university, or the place I was last week, or whatever. Whose traditional territory was I on? So I thought that'd be kind of a cool site on its own. So I broke it away into its own site, and that's kind of how the beginning of Native Land started. Once I had actually set up the basic site itself, then I started thinking a bit more about like what I was actually doing. Of course, I didn't want to just be making something around this topic like Indigenous land, without actually thinking about like, okay, what am I making public and what perception is this putting out? Who is this for? So as a settler, I'm not an Indigenous person. I wanted to not. It was important for me to not try to make something necessarily that was for Indigenous people, so to speak. I didn't want to have this idea of like making some kind of charity thing to improve a community that I don't know or something. So I really kind of thought about how can I aim this at, so-called my community, settlers, uh, the people I grew up with, or the kind of racist things I had heard, or the ignorance I had heard growing up. How could I aim this site towards that? So my original kind of thrust of the idea was to kind of weasel my way into people's consciousness with this non-suspicious application that you could just search your history and learn a bit more, but ultimately plant a seed where people would start to think about Indigenous land, and think about where they were living, and think about the history in a deeper way, and think about, oh, Indigenous people are still here and they're still totally active in this land, and maybe that sign downtown, or maybe that town name is an Indigenous name, and just for it to start coming into their consciousness more. Um, and that was kind of the original argument that I was trying to make with the map, without it being too direct, because I wanted to be able to reach people that wouldn't agree with me from the start. So people that maybe were a little against this idea of Indigenous land, or uncomfortable with it, or had never encountered it, that kind of stuff. So that was fun, and that actually has, in a way, worked. It's generated a lot of conversation over the years. The site has gone viral quite a few times. Just last, it's sometimes Indigenous Peoples Day, sometimes Columbus Day in the States. We had over 250,000 views on the site just in that day, so that was pretty awesome. And kind of the average time people spend on the front page is around 2 minutes, which is pretty high for internet. So people are looking around and people are interested, and it does generate a lot of conversation. Now, what Native Land has been shifting as it's gone under more Indigenous leadership, which I'll be talking about throughout the talk, because it's now a nonprofit. That just happened, I think, about a year ago now. Fully incorporated as the nonprofit, have an Indigenous majority board, and that's kind of started to shift the site from just being kind of what I originally conceived it as, to being something that's a lot more focused on Indigenous people and Indigenous representation, and thinking a bit more deeply about what we're doing as the site is growing so much, and who we're representing and who we're talking to. We have a few like current struggles, or opportunities, things that we're working on. We're working out all the logistical things still, like just simple things, board meetings and employees and all that stuff. Funding is obviously a big one. Everyone's always talking about funding, and it's also been a real thing for us, but it's coming along, hopefully. We're always trying to improve the site itself, the data on the site. We're adding more translations. Ideally, we'd love to get things translated into Indigenous languages soon, not just French, Spanish, and so on. We're wanting to expand the map. We want to add features like audio, so people can pronounce the names of nations. We have tons of ideas and stuff. So that's kind of like where Native Land is at, and some of its history in really quick 5-minute summary. So I'm going to jump into a little bit about how it's been technologically built, or how it's put together. And this has been mainly my work in the technical element. Tons of people have helped out in a lot of ways, Adam included, with a lot of different areas of the site. There's so much different things going on, whether that's improving territories, or helping edit education guides, and there's so many different pieces of the site. But a lot of the tech has been kind of where my strength lies, and that's where I felt I could help out the most. So I was already a web developer for about 5 years, freelance, just a freelance guy. Taught myself before I started Native Land. And I was just starting to get a bit more serious about my development skills when I started the project. And actually, Nativeland and the other site I was talking about with the mapping resource development were actually the first mapping projects I ever did. So I knew like nothing about mapping at all when I started. Um, so when I started, it was really the most basic, jQuery, Google Maps, HTML. I had never heard about the acronym GIS. I didn't know about geographic formats. Don't even think I had a GitHub account, or maybe I did, but there was nothing in it. Didn't know how to use Node really. I was really just like learning how to hack things together and make websites out of anything. I've like hacked WordPress sites and put together basic HTML pages. So I just kind of say that so that people watching, if they have an idea, don't get the sense that you really have to know what you're doing in order to start for some project. You can just start hacking it together. That's certainly what I did, and yeah, it does take work, but you're also learning along the way, and that's frustrating and fun for sure. And the best way to learn is through your own project for sure. Um, so when I started Nativeland, I didn't know how to take these, I was starting to find maps of indigenous territories, and they were almost never in a digital format. They were just like PDFs or JPEGs or whatever. So I didn't know how to trace them, so I really just did this in the most haphazard way. I found like a browser extension for Chrome that would make one window semi-transparent, and I just like put a window of an application I found where you could like draw polygons on Google Maps, and then rolled that on top of JPEG and just started tracing it. And I did that for like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of shapes. And now I know that there's much easier ways to do that, to digitize maps. But at the time, that was the only way that I really could think of even how to approach the problem. And it did work fine, largely because I had the time and the energy. The data was stored totally in a weird way. I was storing them in a Google Maps format, like with actual code in my JSON. Like I had never heard there's this format called GeoJSON that's usually used online for digital maps, but I'd never heard of it before, and definitely if I saw it, I didn't know what I was looking at and just couldn't even felt like understanding it would be a bigger task than building the site. So I just kept going to try to make this thing work. Eventually I did get it to work, even though now if I looked at those files, I'd be like, they're a mess, confusing. But it was enough to get it ready to send around to people. So then from there, as it started to grow and people started to visit the site and started to get suggestions and feedback, and started sending the site to a lot of nations and academics and anyone who I could find that was maybe interested in this thing, get feedback on what I was doing. A lot of the rebuilding that has gone on since then has been about trying to find the right tech and the right simplification of the message to like crystallize the point. So the mapping API, we went through quite a few incarnations. It went through Google Maps, and then someone suggested Leaflet because it's open source. So eventually I rebuilt everything for that. I started learning about these GeoJSON stuff. I used different interface frameworks, whether that was like Material Light, Bootstrap, Semantic UI, like all these different. It was kind of my little test site to try things out. I had to get it working in mobile and whatever. All those things that happen in web development. And so it had different problems with well, specifically in mapping stuff, like the autocomplete that tells where, when you start typing in an address, that completes the address and then gives back the geographic coordinates. I had to kind of stick with Google for a while because Leaflet didn't have quite a good enough one, and also they had usage limits, and as the site grew, we couldn't deal with usage limits because we were starting to get a lot of hits. So I had to, after I rewrote it all in Leaflet, then I rewrote it again in Google, like another chance to improve things. Then I started building the mobile apps. So at that time, I was starting to learn like React.js. So built things in React Native for Android and iOS, which was again a very steep learning curve, took a long time, using like the what is it, and like using Xcode and Android Studio was a nightmare. But eventually I got them onto the app stores, and then I just didn't want to touch them because I was afraid they would break after that. But then I figured I should remake the homepage in React. So again, rebuilding. Eventually, I did end up switching to Mapbox from Google Maps, which took quite a while because Mapbox is a fair bit different than other mapping libraries. But our main technical challenge at the time was becoming like I had too many polygons, and it was starting to freeze the browser because there was like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands, starting to show up, and the searches were starting to get very slow. And as I looked around, I saw that Mapbox has some technical solutions for that. Specifically, they render your data into the tiles and kind of stream it over. So Mapbox was great until we got hit with a bill for like $1,000 for a month, and so I switched back to Google again. Mapbox did get in touch with us, actually, not even about native land, but about a separate thing I had done. I had made a course for Mapbox on Udemy, and they got in touch about that. And then when I told them about native land, they threw us in touch with their community department, and since then they have provided us with all the Mapbox services for free, which I just wanted to say they've been huge help. That's been enormous in helping us be able to run the site and not completely have to shut it down out of cost problems or just straight technical problems. So Mapbox has been awesome. The site is now kind of a mix between WordPress and Mapbox. So I really wanted to be able to have research assistants come onto the site and be able to edit shapes or add resources or just change some information about, be able to edit things without becoming experts in GIS, because I want the research assistants to be able to spend time researching and chatting with the communities, improving the data rather than having to learn how to technically use everything. So built a plugin for my Mapbox and WordPress and built it in the back end. It's a long story. It was quite a bit of work, but it's ultimately ended up having a lot of ease of use, and there's still a lot more fixes to happen. But essentially the site now is WordPress with a React JS front page, running Mapbox GLJS as the API, and then kind of our database for all our data is ultimately in Mapbox. We do have an API as well, open API, that pulls from our Mapbox account daily and then refreshes some GeoJSONs. And I think this is a pretty good combination that we're at right now. I don't see that we have to change it. We do want to make quite a bit of more technical improvements, such as adding like more editing that users can do to submit fixes rather than just emailing us. And I think we can extend that from what we already have going on. We also rewrote the mobile apps at some point in Expo because that was a lot easier for deployment. And we're using Google Maps there because Expo hasn't integrated Mapbox, but it's a pretty good solution still right now. So that's a little bit of tech stuff. Nothing too heavy, but some stuff on mapping and kind of how it had evolved. It's evolved along the way, building on itself, and a lot of rewriting. That's really revisions, rewriting, figuring stuff out along the way is totally normal if you're just getting started with a project. It's really hard to plan it properly before you really know what your needs are. So it certainly meant a lot of extra work, but at the same time, a lot of learning that's helped that even professionally separate from native land. So when we actually add a territory onto the site, typically a research assistant will look for a couple of maps that corroborate each other. Preferably we use maps from a nation itself if it's provided somehow, like maybe a tribal office will email us. Like we get real lucky sometimes when that happens. Most of the time we're just doing the research, and maybe there's a website with a map, maybe. Otherwise we look for a secondary source, or we might find just like a conglomerate map that's of like hundreds of nations, which isn't the best source, but we have used it. And if those don't work, then just any old maps. Sometimes we even use really old kind of colonial style maps. part of the reason for that has been that early on in the site, it was really important for me to just get places mapped rather than try to make it perfect in detail. I didn't want there to be big blank spaces on the map so that when people searched, they would say, oh, I guess no Indigenous people lived here. Uh, that's not the case. So I wanted to at least get something on there and then work on fixing it along with the people that would email us. Has meant some missteps and some errors for sure. But I think it's been a good approach to get the reach and also just the impact of so many shapes on the map that people see. So research assistants will go in, add the links to the resources we used, images of maps we used, then we'll push it to Mapbox, and then it gets added to our database, basically. So some of the future things we want to add to Nativeland in terms of technical stuff, we want to add some more ability to like import large data sets. So if we get somebody to digitize a whole bunch of data for, say, like Brazil or something, we want to be able to put that all in at once rather than have to do it shape by shape because it can be a lot of work. We want to add more collaborative ability, as I mentioned earlier. So right now, people really just have to email us if they have a fix, but it would be nice if we could allow certain users to edit maps themselves or submit their drawn maps along with resources. It's going to be kind of hard because, you know, it's hard about who has authority to tell us what map is what map is authentic. It's a very tricky issue that it's part of what the board is there to help deal with. But we would like to make it more collaborative, to have people feel like they're more a part of the process of creation of the improvement of the site. And we also want to start categorizing shapes or, the territories or languages a bit more effectively, maybe creating some more structure than just a front page map and then a whole bunch of sub pages. Whether that would be, we could even do language families, or I'm not even sure how we want to categorize, but there's probably some smart ways to do that. So, okay, that's a little bit of technical stuff. I wanted to talk a bit more now about logistical elements and kind of the people that have helped build the site along the way. So let's see, that can range from the kind of people that get in touch with us, like just through emailing, to how we hire or how we're trying to hire. And then beyond that, of course, to the importance of the new, not really new, a year old or so, board of directors, and the kinds of questions they help out with or what they do with the organization. So from the very start, Nativeland has got a lot of participation from users, which is really encouraging from very early on. The topic is definitely controversial, and it's increasingly visible. Like the Indigenous rights, land rights, territory acknowledgement is being pushed hard by Indigenous people, and it's getting noticed a lot more than I thought I would see in the last few years, for sure. We have encouraged users to get in touch and get mad at us, tell us their thoughts, correct our mistakes, and we have got responses. Sometimes we're even inundated and we can't keep up. Like on those really busy days, we might get dozens and dozens and dozens, and it can be tricky to try to keep up and make sure that we're respectfully dealing with each question or fix. So we tend to get a few types of feedback. We'll get general comments, we'll get fixes, and then we'll get just like requests for how, or questions on how people want to use the site themselves. So if we start with general comments, they might just be, sometimes we just get thank yous, which are great and easy to deal with, or a little suggestion about an interface thing. Or we get emails that are like really intense, that might criticize the whole basis of the site on a theoretical level, and that can come from left and right sides of the political spectrum. Progressive people may tell us that we're perpetuating colonial ways of thinking by using incorrect labels or these mapping techniques, or by representing nations that are government created, things like that. Maybe that we're trying to benefit from the map. Some people think that we try to make a profit, which we don't. But some people might think that. or from the right, more people might attack us for trying to pander to some kind of political correctness by making this site. Um, that we should just get over the past and move on. These kind of arguments. Like I, from the beginning of the site, I've always tried to listen a lot to these because I'm not someone who necessarily knows how to do all this. And some of these arguments I really have to take to heart. Um, and I have taken them to heart, especially early in the site's history when I really was asking people to send me feedback. I do tend to listen more to the progressive arguments because I'm not going to just shut down the site because of political correctness, whatever that means. But the queries that, or the criticisms that mean the most definitely are ones that come from Indigenous people about concerns about their own representation. Let's say we're missing them on the map, or they're concerned about a certain nation being on the map. Those are definitely the ones that touch the most. I think because ultimately the goal is to respectfully provide information. I guess at least that's what it has been. Provide information about these different nations, make them visible. And so when I get a message of them doing it in a bad way, it can be pretty panicking. Actually, kind of I really want to fix it, and I'm not quite so empathetic to some angry white dude trying to get the site shut down for some reason because it offends him. That's not quite so important. So when it comes to who's behind the site in terms of whose comments make the most importance, do try to prioritize and just do naturally Indigenous representation, I think. Same with fixes. When people send in fixes, ideally we get fixes from people, maybe like I said, a tribal office or a band office, but it's very rare that happens. Most often we do get just someone will send a comment saying, "Oh, I lived in whatever place and I thought it was this nation or this nation, and why is your map saying something different?" And that'll just tell us to do a bit more research in that area. Lots of times people will just send comments that say it's wrong and no information, no resources or anything. So we don't really have a lot we can do with that, but we do make a note of it. And then if we get a lot of those comments, then we really take a look. A lot of times we need to make things more complex. This was definitely the case in Aotearoa, where at first I just added a big shape around all of New Zealand saying Maori. And someone told me, yeah, no, it's a bit more complicated than that. And so found another resource that broke it into 10 or 15 groups. And again, got more messages saying, yeah, no, it's way more complex. And so, got more resources. And now there's, I don't even know, probably 100 different nations or tribes mapped in New Zealand there. And we have stopped getting the messages telling us that it's not right. So I don't know if that means that it's better, but I think that increasing the complexity is a really important part of how people contribute, because with such a huge reach and we do have board members around the world, but we're not everywhere. And sometimes we just oversimplify, and a lot of the resources that exist are oversimplified. So people complicating things is very welcome and great. We also get people want us to map other areas of the world, like people want us to map the Ainu in Japan or the Sami in Europe. People want us to start taking on Africa or India, Iran. And we would like to move into mapping those areas, but we're still trying to figure out a lot of our process, not to mention funding and all that. And to just improve what we've already done and make sure that it's being done in a good way. It's easy to just, and I did this earlier in the history of the site, is just run full speed to try to do as much as possible. But I think it is time to slow down and look a little more carefully what we're doing, and then we can start up again once we understand what we're doing on a global level. It's definitely gets complicated even theoretically, like how to define indigeneity when you're talking about Africa or you're talking about India, or Europe for that matter. It does get quite complicated. Again, part of the reason we have a board. Now, in terms of general contact, this is pretty cool. We get like, media requests and stuff, but even more interesting, we get a lot of people who want to use native land in their own ways, and that might be simple projects like school kids who are doing a presentation and they want to use it. Sometimes we get professors who are writing books, they want to cite native land, or there's people making art projects, there's museums, there's libraries, they want to show it on some screen. And we're pretty open to all this stuff, as long as people cite it and don't treat it as like an absolute source of truth. It is kind of almost a Wikipedia level quality, maybe even less, I don't know. But it's not like a government level. This is absolutely the truth about all these nations, territories. It's collaborative. So we try to make sure people treat it that way when they're using it. We do tend to reject like government or corporate related projects. I mean, that could be different depending on the project, but when like here in Canada, Department of Indigenous Affairs gets in touch to want to use the site to find out like who they should collaborate with, in my opinion, that's like not appropriate because they have their own resources and they may also have like some problematic intentions going on. So we try to steer away from that, but when it comes to these kind of broad applications that different organizations are doing, we really love that people are integrating it and using the API and doing all kinds of cool stuff, connecting with each other, because I think the impact of native land is much bigger in that way than in just having the site. It creates connections between people, it gets them thinking about what they can do, and gets them creating things themselves with this, and that's awesome. So I'll just, let's see what time. Oh, okay, I got 20 minutes or so, 15 minutes. So I'll jump into talking about the board a bit. So in learning, I had to set up the board. It had a lot to do with all the emails and all the people that got in touch with me, and just really learning a lot more about the issues at work, and realizing that I couldn't just run this thing, and it wasn't really responsible to do that. And I just don't have the capability. I'm kind of a technical guy. I do like the theory, but I also I can't justify everything I'm doing on theoretical grounds. So trying to find board members who could not only guide me, but ultimately maybe take over the project, hand over the site to Indigenous people, which is kind of a big category, doesn't mean a lot, but to hand over the site to people who identify with who's being mapped. That's the goal, to make it represent people a little better. And developing or creating that board and it coming together, especially in the past few months, has started to really help clarify what the site means to people and what it can mean to people, like who we are, what it can be, who's running this site. And a lot of those meanings have come down to wanting to make it a site that's not an encyclopedia about Indigenous people, but it's a resource by Indigenous people. And a lot of the things we want to do in the future are about going in that direction, about making this more participatory and more representative of the people that are being mapped, not just making it more accurate for accuracy's sake. Making it more about land and what land means to people. It's important. So our board is majority Indigenous. We have Lee is the previous presenter is in there. We also have, I'll just read off some names of people that are in it. We have Lena Minifee, who's from Simchian from British Columbia. We have Shauna Johnson, who's Coast Salish from British Columbia. We have Messiah Bursiaga Hamid, who is Afro-Indigenous and based mostly in New York, works a lot with youth organizations. Rudo Kemper, who's based in South America and the US and works a lot in mapping. And Lee, who's Maori and based in Aotearoa, and who's an awesome tech CEO. Then we also have an advisory council, which is made up of some people. There's Aaron Carapella, who's quite well known for his maps, his tribal nations maps. He's Cherokee from Oklahoma. And then we have a few academics involved as well, and people who have quite a bit of experience building maps with Indigenous people. Stephanie Pine, Tyler McCreary, Margaret Pierce, and Jean-Luc Fournier. All people that we feel like we can lean on to answer some of these harder questions about defining indigeneity, who belongs on the site, who doesn't, and where we should expand, how to do that, what our processes should be. It's been important to us to pick board members that do have a strong connection to traditional land or the understanding of land, maybe even the spiritual importance of land in their culture, so that we don't lose sight and just make this about technology. It's a site that's deeper than that, that is about land and about tradition and what narrative that we're telling here. So that's been really important, and it's been really exciting for me to see that coming together, because it's made my efforts much stronger and made me have more faith in this site and where it's going, as it touches so many people around the world. So we meet every month or so, just talk about do a board meeting, talk about where the site's going, what's happened, latest things going on, raise any questions, and that's been fantastic. Really, it's been great to be able to hand over a bit of that authority of running the site while still being quite involved in day to day in how things are going on, and just being able to lean on people and not try to run things in a total entrepreneur self-run way all the time. I tend to always go in that direction, but it's been a good lesson to learn to go slower and build the relationships and really listen to people, take feedback and take the help that people want to offer. So I really am thankful to the board for that. Okay, in the little bit of time remaining here, I just want to talk a bit more about what I've learned from Native Land and just my kind of excitement at where we're going. So for me, Native Land has taught me a lot about like perseverance and also kind of being humble, whether that's through like the tech stuff where I had to rebuild things a lot, really having an idea that you believe in, or that is affecting people in a way that you think is positive, can really help you persevere through a lot of difficulty in terms of these technical hurdles or time or people getting mad at you, stuff like that. And being humble in the sense that not having a sense that I know how to do this that well has let me be more open to learning from what people teach me. People email me even when it's confrontational, or maybe even better when it's confrontational, because I know I have to listen, or when people are upset, knowing that this site is important to them, that it means something, has been a very valuable thing for me. So that's been great, and it's been really awesome to be able to work with Indigenous people as a settler, and to try to do that in a good way, whether that's trying to avoid the free labor problem that often happens with Indigenous people, because there's so many nonprofits that are trying to get free work, and I'm sorry, the board members were trying to get more funding. So, but we do make sure that our employees are paid fairly and everything. We don't want it to try to lean on too much free labor, because these expertise is worth a lot to us, and the value of working with people who have a lot of wisdom to share, whether that's about relationship building, about tradition, or about the land itself. It's been very valuable. And just learning to, again, take the advice, listen to people, be grateful for all these people that want to help and reach out, has been really important for me. And then also just that it's really cool to see that something that can be done with tech can be such a valuable thing in the non-tech world, that it can make an argument that's kind of on those activist levels and touch on a lot, is really great. So I didn't leave a ton of time for questions there, but I will stop now and take maybe next 10 minutes if there's any questions. Definitely excited. We're going to lots of places with Native Land, so if you have questions about that, feel free. But yeah, thanks again for the opportunity to present and just talk a little about native land and what we are and where we've been and where we're going. So, thanks.
Cool. Well, I definitely have a lot of questions. There's no questions in the chat that I can see now, but one thing that really has, well, so this is kind of part of like a broader thing, which is localization. And is the API, yeah, I don't even know how to phrase it or even talk about it because I guess when we're talking about localization, there's, some kind of software out there in open source that allows you to do localization. But I'm wondering, how do we extend that and how do we offer that to indigenous communities? And I guess I see this as at least the API, extending it to being an open API in order to facilitate that kind of personalization, I guess, for sites in indigenous communities and for people living in the territories of indigenous peoples. Have you discussed that or talked about that or considered that in any way?
So the API is open right now, so people can use it to
Awesome.
do their own projects and everything. When you're talking about localization, you're talking more about like language localization or about
Right. Yeah. Language localization
right.
and
Uh,
having the boundary, having that API boundary then facilitates, and the API I think facilitates at least knowing, however accurate the boundary is to then facilitate a site that can offer things in the traditional language.
yeah, like we've definitely like that's we've spent a little bit of time, well, actually recently, really improving the internationalization of the site itself, um, which I hope can then translate into having better language localization when it comes to what the API provides. I mean, we're really, if people do have a project that they they want to do and they find the API is not quite sufficient or unable to query what they want to query, because it is kind of, I did kind of just throw it together years ago and it's still the same. I would just encourage them to get in touch and tell me what they need, and I will do the work to try to make that happen. And I just love hearing how people are using it. So if there's some interesting way that someone's using that to draw in a shape or to try to increase the visibility of their nation or their language, that to me would be really really cool to see. Or maybe if we hook in some kind of um, a bit more of the resources for language learning, and then people can draw in those shapes. Yeah, I mean, I'm open to all those kinds of ideas, but there's nothing we're really working on right now with the API specifically. Doing a lot more kind of logistical and funding work these days. It's still some tech work, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it wouldn't all be on your shoulders. It would just be you, ha, crowdsourcing like the information to like create the boundaries. I think
Right.
presents the opportunity for people to take that information and be like, okay, hey, you're in these boundaries. Let's serve up to you the site in the indigenous language.
Yeah, yeah, that's actually really cool. I'm gonna I make a note of that because there might be some people out there. There have been some cool kind of some larger companies that have got in touch with us that I don't know do like camping bookings and stuff like that, and they want to provide some information about like traditional territories when people are doing their bookings, and that could be extended to then have some language included too. So I think that could be cool.
Um, Another thing I wanted to ask is apparently people at Google have also been mapping the territories of tribes, like just the current land or territories that they own. Is that something that you have all been involved with in any way, or have they reached out to you, or I was just curious if they would, if you would be open to working with them.
Right.
Just just some thoughts on that.
Yeah, yeah. So they haven't reached out to us about that. From my understanding, they're doing like kind of reservation kind of boundaries. So like you said, like current um, legal, like government legal sanctioned territories of Indigenous people, which is fairly different. We have avoided doing that. I guess the closest thing to that we have done is um, doing treaties, which are still quite a bit broader than modern day reservation land because of all the legal stuff that's happened, right, and lots of things. And we, all that reservation data is all available directly from governments. They have that data, and lots of like Canadian government and U.S. government do provide that. I think set somewhere. So I felt like mapping that would just be replicating work that's already there, and in a way, was kind of going against. I mean, unless you're trying to make a point that like, look how little land there is now compared to the traditional territory. That's a pretty good point to make. But yeah, we really wanted to focus on traditional territories and the size of them and kind of extent. If Google wanted to like work on doing traditional territory work with us, I mean, they have enormous resources. So we definitely be open to chatting with them. We haven't talked to them much. I had one meeting with some Google people because they wanted to know what we were doing with all the autocomplete, and we chatted with them, but we haven't been able to get any free stuff really out of them. Or I don't know if maybe it just didn't hit a note with them. Uh, but I'd definitely be open to. We do try to be careful about it, and our board would obviously talk about that and try to make sure that, well, not try, would absolutely make sure that it's being done in a way that we think is ethical, or else we just not interested. But yeah, but we are open to that for sure, and we haven't really chatted with them very much. So, yeah.
Cool. Um, Another comment question that I had was, and I'm not sure like how much this has impacted the work now. I imagine it might impact the work in the future, um, but still just curious. Like, I imagine that there are maybe conflicting reports or understandings of what territory is owned by certain groups.
Sure.
How have you kind of addressed that? I suppose in the best way possible, which is I'm not sure if there is a way, but how do you how have you addressed that at this point? And I imagine because these things will happen in the future, has how has the board consulted you on these kinds of things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting question, and one of the reasons I didn't bring it up is because it actually happens very little. It's surprising how little, with all the kind of vagueness of these territories and the sources being not the best and everything. How little we get emails saying something like, "Hey, that traditional territory, that group is ours. Don't make it theirs." I can only think of maybe a couple times that's actually happened. One that does come to mind is with the Haudenosaunee with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, kind of in kind of Great Lakes area. Uh, that was a really tough one, partly because that confederacy, it has to do with historical reasons. Like that confederacy was put together at a relatively late date and claimed a lot of land that the members of the confederacy hadn't really inhabited. Especially, we got quite a few people from modern day Michigan emailing us to say like, hey, there was no Iroquois or Haudenosaunee people living here historically, stuff like that. Um, so when people email us that, are at least in the past, my initial reaction is always to go, okay, before I'm going to reduce a territory down, I want to get more evidence than if I was going to expand it, just because it's a little more benign to expand it because we don't make, as you know if you visit the site, we don't make the territories exclusive. They overlap, and so there's some room to say, okay, some people use this, and other people use this, and another set of people use this. We all had traditional territory in the same place. Okay. Um, but taking it away is a bit more making a statement to say like, no, that's not your traditional territory, even though you say it is, which is quite a stronger statement and takes a lot more evidence. But with the amount of feedback that we got about the Haudenosaunee over quite a while and a lot of resources from people, we did reduce it a little um, out of some of those areas. Otherwise, it really doesn't happen very often, and I think that's part of the strength of the overlapping shapes approach. Is that people, even if they're not sure about one nation really taking up all the space that they do on the map, it's not so exclusive that they feel the need to really make something of it. And people will usually say, "Oh, I don't think that group was actually here." We do a little research, and usually we end up expanding the map. That's usually what people are actually interested in, rather than having us reduce another nation's map. So it's been less of an issue than it might seem like it would be, and less than I anticipated when I started it, which has been nice because it points to some kind of like understanding that shared territory is a real thing, and that um, boundaries don't have to be absolutely hard, mine or yours, in all this history. So yeah.
Cool. So I guess the real question is JavaScript or TypeScript?
Yeah, I should probably do more TypeScript. I should, but it's been all JavaScript, man. Um, it's just about it's for me. It's just been all about ease of getting things together, really. So
Cool. Um, what else? Well, I can't think of much else now, but you've spoken for almost an hour. Do you have a closing statement at all that you'd like to?
just to thank you, yeah, just to thank the conference and thank you for the invitation and for putting it together and being brave enough to just have an idea and get it going. And I think that's really great. And to thank again the board of Native Land for helping out so much and being able, and the people that email us to inspire me personally, as well as like wanting to make an impact. And I just want to encourage people that if you do have an idea and you're not sure about how to get it started, email us or just start hacking away at it. You can make something that matters and that makes an impact in people's lives, even if you don't really know what you're doing when you start it. So that's about it.
Awesome. Thank you. So that concludes the conference. Thanks everyone for attending wherever you were in the world. Um, and yeah, we'll see you next year. Be on the lookout for a conference happening somewhere in Oklahoma, probably Tulsa. Um, so yeah, be on the lookout for that.